Alhamdulillah, when, Sheikh Jihad is, he is literally, my first teacher in Kalam. So when your teacher says, I want you to do this, you just basically say yes, okay. So alhamdulillah, I don't know how good it is, but we'll find out if it's useful or not, inshallah. So, yeah, the topic of universals, and there's many ways to approach this issue. And as was mentioned today in our earlier session with Dean, these are questions that people have been asking for many, many years. Not just centuries, more than thousands and thousands of years. These are questions that, and there is people in asking, and there are also a variety of answers to these questions. And Muslims are, by and large, not unique in addressing these questions. Although I do think we have some interesting solutions, perhaps, that may not be, that I think we do have to offer and contribute to the conversation for our own purposes as Muslims, but also maybe for humanity at large. So you have the essay. So what I'll do for this session here is, in about 20-30 minutes, I'll try to get through some of the key points of the essay. We're not going to read the whole thing; it'll be here for hours. But I'll try to capture some of the key points in the essay, and at the same, so I'll be referring to it as we go through. But I also have some, sections here that I've put up that we can look at. These are all from the essay itself, so I'll go ahead and refer to those as we are going through. We heard a wonderful, a presentation today on the analytic tradition in the West. But the question of universals I include in the first part I kind of trace it back to more of the scholastic tradition in the West. I do have a paragraph on page 3 where I do want to highlight that this very same question has occurred in different traditions, different civilizations too. So I do make mention of the Buddhist and Hindu philosophical traditions here. And then I highlight, some of the key, you do see some of the key questions, the same questions being asked, but in different traditions. And towards the end, I do state that, for example, how the Buddhists have approached the issues of universals, so they basically would adopt what's known as a nominalist position, right? And again, I put all these terms as placeholders, right? That's part of our thing. It's just it's a language we understand, but again, what do we mean by these terms? That's something that we always have to keep that in mind and always ask further questions. And the Hindus, by and large, adopted a more what's referred to as a realist position. But what's interesting here, the Buddhists will say, even though it's called a nominalist position, but they would say here, I say the Buddhists developed what's called an exclusion differentiation theory of cognition, where a term like cow, for example, signifies all things that are not cows. Is that what I said here? Yeah, all things that are not cows. It's a very different way of looking at things, right? So instead of, the point here is that you do see the same questions of metaphysics, right, being addressed in different traditions throughout all of, ever since human beings were around, basically. And so that's something to look into. And there are some really nice studies being done in English, about the Hindu philosophical tradition, the Buddhist philosophical tradition as well. And actually, if you go to India right now, currently, there's some wonderful lectures and presentations. They're really doing some fantastic jobs on articulating their own philosophical tradition. So that's something to pay attention to. But, that's just a highlight. Basically, when you look at what we would call like kind of the post-classical Ash'ari tradition, that's kind of what we're going to focus on. I want to focus on in this paper. And so, but before we do so, there is what I call an Abyssinian background, right, to this. And is there a background to the Abyssinian background? There is, right? And which shows you that, an Abyssinian will actually say the terminology, the framework that he deploys in his works, he does say this is not something he invented, it's something that he's following others. Who those others are, he doesn't really mention. But that's a good topic of research to find out where is Avicenna himself getting these type of, this framework on universals here. But first thing to talk about here, I address in the paper is, where do we look right, in our tradition, where do these conversations on these various issues take place, right? A student of the Islamic sciences will invariably counter this topic in books of logic, right? And yet in the manuals of logic, they would actually say that this has nothing to do with logic. Right? And so where is it located? And in the books of logic, they will say this falls outside the craft of logic. Rather, this is an issue of metaphysics, ilahiyat, as one of the names for it. So it's and specifically here, what are universals and what's the ontological status of universals? It's considered an issue of metaphysics, not logic. Although it's discussed in books of logic, for anyone who studied logic knows, because you talk about universals and then you talk about particulars, right, in logic, and then the kulliyatul khams, come under that. So when you talk about a genus, species, differentia, accident, and property, those are all considered kulliyat or universals. So hence, it comes in there. So what are universals then? So having, kind of situated what type of issue, what discipline is responsible for the universals and their ontological status. What is a universal? So Avicenna here, and the reason why we're going through him is because he does provide that background for later theological conversations on this topic. He says that the universal is spoken of in three ways. This is on page 5, but I have it up here as well. That the universal is spoken of in three ways. So universal is, when kulli, we can say, is said of the meaning by way of its being actually predicated of many. And what he means by that is you can have one meaning, and that meaning is predicated of different particulars, many different particulars. For example, the human being, right? So we can predicate human being of multiple number of particulars, and then hence this kulli, this concept human being, is considered a universal. Universal is also predicated of a meaning if it is permissible for it to be predicated of many. So you're not actually predicating it of many particulars, but it is possible to do so.
And you're rendering musharaka in terms of predication.
Correct.
That's effectively what it means by
the
term musharaka.
Exactly, yeah, exactly. Even if it is not a condition that these should exist in actuality. As for example, and Ibn Sina used this, and I was trying to figure out where he got this, but a heptagonal house, right? For some reason, I guess people didn't have...
They didn't have heptagonal
houses back then, right? He hasn't been to California, I guess, right? Where you have more... Yeah, so, but he uses that as an example where it's the concept itself is able to be predicated of many particulars, yet there is no particular for it, which does bring up questions we'll look at briefly at the end, for some analytic schools, and please correct me here, Dean, that some analytic schools hold that for something to be a universal, it must have an instantiation, right? Others differ as well. That
so the class of chimeras and griffins.
There must be a particular, yeah. And we're seeing here in this conception, no, universal may have one, but it doesn't have to have an instantiation of that. And but it does not follow necessarily that these many exist. And nay, not even one of. And the third meaning of universal is also said of the meaning whose very conception does not prevent it being predicated of many, right? So the concept itself allows for multiple predications. And if you were to predicate it of many, it doesn't entail any contradiction or impossibility and logical possibility.
Does everybody feel good about just leaving the whole idea of participation?
There you go.
Classical definition and just going straight to predication, because that seems to be what is at stake here.
It's very, Plato would not be too happy, with this, because, his understanding is you participate in the universal, every particular in this.
Well, in the Arabic,
participation,
but a lot of our oftentimes if we stick too closely to the translations, we don't have useful wordage.
Alternatives, yeah.
What is in Arabic? What is it?
Yushariku or ma yamna'u sharikatu, right? Sorry, sharikatu.
Ma yamna'u ma'nan la yamna'u wuku'a sharikati fihi.
Yeah.
But I like that. You know, I
Yeah.
think that it's good to depart. You just have to make sure that when we are taking, being liberal with the translation,
Yeah.
we're taking everybody with us,
Yeah,
right? So obviously, people do what they do.
yeah,
But if we can generate this lingua franca, or something close to it, right, in Urdu, if you will, because that's what Urdu is, you know, the more that we have some commonalities, right? Not in
Yeah.
a way that it prevents people from doing unique and outstanding work that may be a departure and stuff like that, but still, in order to do this stuff in English, you know, we do have to sort of generate this.
yeah, vocabulary.
Can I ask an ignorant historical question?
Sure, sure.
About this?
I didn't hear it.
So, in English translations of
So if I
Plato,
talk out.
you'll probably have participation. In English translations of Aristotle, you'll probably have predicable or predicated of many.
Yeah.
Which would Avicenna have been more comfortable with?
That actually comes up, there's some material in the paper. I don't address that specifically, but in terms of how Avicenna understood the ontological status of universals, it definitely wasn't in a Platonic sense. So, although participation wouldn't be too bad lexically, even the word sharika would allow for that. It would allow for both. But I think in light of his understanding of the ontological status of universals, I think what Sheikh Jihad is saying is exactly right. You just have to take people by the hand and say, okay, just keep this in mind.
That's a key determiner.
Yeah.
Right? Because there is an ontology that's happening in this phraseology. So
Yeah.
I'm very conscious of it if one or the other is going to be
Oh yeah, absolutely.
preferred.
Yeah, but the participation makes you become the predicate. So there's a becoming relation with the participation. In terms of Avicenna, when he's talking about musharaka, does being predicated with that property, is there some becoming involved? Because in the Greek, like Socrates predicated, he participates in wisdom. There's a becoming in the participation. There is that nuance. But you're right, for going forward,
That would
we
be
just need
very
to pick-
realist. That would be quite realist.
There is that there. So
Yeah, yeah. It's definitely there.
you're right, if you just go forward with the word, you're right, CD.
Yeah.
Otherwise, we're just going to get stuck on the word and then...
We should, I definitely flag that though, you know, as important, yeah. Now, the one thing the other to keep in mind before we move on here, and this is important as it relates to the question of ontology, is when we say something's a universal, are we describing a term or a word, or are we describing what he says here is the concept or the ma'na, right? And he's very clearly saying here it's the ma'na. So, which is very important distinction. You know, many people would say, yes, I believe that you can predicate the word human being of multiple particulars, right? And that's very different than saying the concept itself is being predicated.
Concept is ma'na.
Ma'na, yeah, or the meaning, or I think a good translation's intentions, you know, as well. But meaning works too. They both work, you know, in that sense. So this is important to keep in mind when we're talking about, you know, as you know, where do we fall on, as you know, the questions that Sheikh Jihad raised. Maybe in some ways we're realists, maybe in some ways we're nominalists. And now a nominalist will say, well, a term can be predicated of many, but the concept, do we form concepts? Because concept is an act for us, as we'll see here, is of the soul, right? The soul is generating through the process of abstraction a concept. And so what Avicenna is talking about here is the concept, which is predicated, as opposed to just the term itself, right? So it's important to keep that in mind as we continue, you know, our conversation here on this. He makes he makes two distinctions I want to point out that are really helpful. The first distinction that he makes, that's on the, actually let me get to this edition here. Yeah, on page 6, on the paragraph, a major aspect of Avicenna's theory of universals is his distinction between universal qua universal and the universal qua essence, or the nature of something. What is this distinction that he's going to make here? What is he talking about here? is that we can consider the concept of universality, right, as it is a universal. That's one distinction we need to keep in mind that human beings make.
Are we talking about the kulliya al-mantiqiyya?
That's going to come up, yeah.
So this is not.
This is going to, he's going to build into this, based on these distinctions here. So when we say we have a concept of something being universal, of a kulli, of a universal, and then that's to be distinguished, right, between when we say the word humans or insan is a universal. Those are two different, we have to make sure we're separating those concepts, right? Because there's two different things going on here, Avicenna wants to tell us, right? And the universal qua universal is anyone, and so what is, in these three definitions of universal that we just read, Avicenna is speaking here of universal qua universal. He's not speaking of when we say humans or humanity or humanness is a universal, right? He's not speaking about that. So he's just speaking about universal qua universal, not universal qua essence in this thing.
Concept of universal.
Exactly, as opposed to this thing being universal, being predicated of a particular thing. So that's what he says here. The concept universal is altogether other than the concept of the nature of something or essence of something. And he gives the example of human and horse. So the concept hoarseness is not the same and is other than the concept of universality, right? Hoarseness doesn't imply universality, and universality doesn't imply hoarseness. It's a separate act of the mind that's actually comes posterior to we conceive universality and we conceive hoarseness. Then we say hoarseness is a universal, right? That's a separate act of the mind. That's and so he wants to. That's a very important distinction that he's going to bring up here, right? And it's important to keep that in mind as we go through this. There's another distinction that he makes that informs his presentation here, which is that when we are considering the nature of something, so the nature qua nature of a thing, right? He makes another distinction here, and this is at the bottom of page 6. So he says he differentiates between two statements. We can say an animal, inasmuch as it is an animal, is an abstraction, without the condition of some other thing. So we're just thinking of pure animal, without any other condition, right, being predicated in our minds, or we're imposing on that. And then we can also consider animal in as much as it is an animal as an abstraction, with the condition that there was no other thing. So in Arabic that would be, the first one is, we can say, al-haywan bila shart shay. And then the second distinction is al-haywan bi shart la shay. Right.
And can you take us through the two, translate, give us a nice working sentence, and then take us through the nuances between the two?
Yeah, so here, we'll go through statement A first, right? Statement A is bila shart shay. And what that means here on page 7, you say here, with this distinction, what this distinction entails is we're considering the nature or essence of a thing from different aspects. So we're looking at, in this case, animal, al-haywan, as, not as a universal yet, just animal, the nature, right, of animality, we could say. Actually, I'll say animal. Animality will be universal. So, and so we can look at it from two aspects, Avicenna is going to say here. One is the nature of a thing. In the case of an animal, when considered without the condition of some other thing. In other words, I'm not saying, I'm not even, in my mind, I'm not bringing to my mind animal, or I'm not saying only animal. I'm just thinking animal, and that's it. That's bila shart shay. It's not conditioned by any other thing, and it's not considered. So animal is not considered in relation to any other thing, just animal itself. And then he says here, so in the statement, yes, so thus animal is taken to be animal qua animal in abstraction, unconditioned. That's in bila shart shay. The second statement entails considering the nature of a thing, stripping it of all properties accidental to it. So in other words, I'm saying animal, and I also bring to my mind, I'm stripping it of all of its particular qualities and as well. So there's something, so it's like you're considering animal, the essence of a thing, but not just animal solely, you're thinking animal being stripped away from all its particulars. And that's a condition, right, in this way. So, bishart la shay.
Yeah, do you mean stripped away those things that are not essential to it?
Correct.
Stripped away.
Correct, yeah.
Okay.
Now, when you have that in your mind, that's another consideration of the essence. And that's the second meaning here, bishart la shay, right? And why is this important? And so he's going to bring this up here. He's going to say, under this aspect, even predication does not come into the consideration of the nature of a thing, the essence of a thing. In statement A. Statement A, right, bila shart shay, you're not thinking of predication whatsoever. In bi shart la shay, in statement B, predication does enter into that conception of the essence. So
you're considering it and
then you're
rejecting
you're predicating it. So this is a very nuanced but a very important distinction that he makes. And Aquinas takes this to solve a lot of problems that he encountered with Aristotle, and he comes up with his own theory, But
so he uses the same framework.
yeah, pretty much.
Yeah.
Yeah, and he uses this to. And then mutlaq, bishart shay. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it's very interesting, how he worked on this. So, building on this now, what we want to talk, like, how is this related to our universal, the topic of universals? What he's going to say here is the essence as unconditioned. Right. This is on continuing on page 7, second paragraph. The unconditioned essence, bila shart shay, corresponds to. Another way of classifying it is al-mahi al-mutlaqa, which is an indeterminate essence. It corresponds to that in this framework, where it has the potential of being predicated of other essences. In this case, you can say rationality or something like that. It has that potential. It's not being predicated yet, but it has the potential to do so. Another term for the indeterminate essence, and this is it's in our tradition, it's called al-kulli al-tabi'i, or the natural universal, right? And this is where there's going to be a lot of conversations on now as to what's the ontological status of this natural universal, and is it a universal itself, right? Even though it's called al-kulli al-tabi'i, we have to be careful not to be misled by this term kulli, right, in this sense,
Universal.
Universal, yeah.
And then when we are getting to the point we're talking about kulliyat tabi'ah, I'm not
Yeah.
going to push us into it. That's up to that's you're going to lead us there.
Yeah.
But we are also talking about something that is outside of the mind. Now we're outside of the mind.
Correct, because we're
Even though
talking.
the reference obviously is being applied from inside, but it's referring to something that actually here
Yeah.
now we've ventured out
Yeah.
into the extra mental.
Yeah. And now, is it something that exists outside, like what is its status outside the mind? Right, and that's what we're going to come to shortly. And just for the purpose, and then we can talk more about this. There is so the negatively conditioned essence, which is bishart la shay, that corresponds to al-mahi al-mujarrada, or a pure abstracted essence. And then the third is the mahi al-makhluta, which is a mixed essence, and that basically is, if you're going to take the essence human, and you consider it in relation to a particular. So Zaid, for example, right? It's like saying George for a Zaid. It's just a common name, And so when you're saying Zaid is a human, that's called the mixed essence. It's a mahi al-makhluta, because you're considering that essence as it's instantiated in this case. So I don't want to spend too much time on this. Let's get to universals now. But we kind of see where al-kulli tabi'i falls in the picture of a conception of essences. And so these are the various ways we can, the aspects under which an essence can and should be considered, right? So here there's a tripartite division that we find in our works. Both Avicennan and Ash'ari theologians, of a universal. Yeah, on the first paragraph on page 8. So this tripartite division of the universal, you see these divided into what's called the natural universal, al-kulli al-tabi'i, the logical universal, al-kulli al-mantiqi, and what they'll call the mental universal, al-kulli al-aqli. Some people translate it as a rational universal, but I don't know. We can talk about that.
Mental.
I use mental, but I'm open to different suggestions here, you know. So everything we talked about the essence now, right? We can now look at a universal, right? So basically what we're doing is we're taking our first discussion on a universal, the three ways it's used. We're taking our conception of the essences, of an essence under different aspects, and we're going to bring those together now. And they come together in this type of rubric here, where you look at a universal and they'll say, well, we have what's called a natural universal, a logical universal, and a mental universal. And we can read on what he means about this on page 8. Why is it being called a natural universal? What's natural about it? So he says here, is that if we take the natural universal and examine the way the term natural is being used, we can see both. We can see the ontological commitments being made by Avicenna, as well as logical commitments. The term natural, in one sense, refers to the nature or essence of a thing. So the kulli tabi'i it will be al-insan min haythu huwa huwa. It's going to be the essence of a particular thing. And it corresponds to the unconditioned, indeterminate essence, meaning al-mahi al-mutlaqa. In the second sense, so that's one understanding of natural. The second sense, the term natural also refers to the nature or quiddity as it exists extramentally. This is Avicenna's position so far. Sometimes simply to what is natural in the sense of belonging to the extramental natural order. So it's called natural because it exists extramentally. For Avicenna, the term natural universal carries with it logical and ontological intentions then, right? Logical meaning that it refers to the essence, indeterminate essence, and also ontological in the sense of it has extramental existence. This is evidence when Avicenna speaks of the ontology. So I bring a quote here, and I just make a footnote here. In the Latin tradition, this is called by people like there's John of St. Thomas, who's a Dominican. He calls this the metaphysical universal, right? Yeah, it's interesting, you know. And at the same time, and then he actually defines it as the metaphysical universal as the nature itself, the nature of a thing itself, or subject abstracted from several things, and it's called the metaphysical universal. Again, that's a translation from the Latin too. So, but I think it works out pretty well here. But there's a footnote I included on there. Now, for Avicenna here, this natural universal does exist extramentally. The question here now we need to ask is, what does he mean by it existing? Just how does it exist extramentally? Right. This is kind of the question here, right? And so on the next page, on page 9, we see Avicenna's position. He says at the top, Avicenna maintains that the natural universal does not exist extramentally as a universal. So there's no universal kind of floating around outside, right?
Separate.
That separate, independent, right? Separated from, you know, each of us like human, insan, right? Just kind of there, you know. It doesn't exist as a universal, in which kind of, you know, we're all predicating that universal of different particulars. He states that it is impossible for a nature to exist in the concrete and to be a universal in actuality. In other words, particulars exist only ontologically, right? That is, it alone is common to all things in kind. Rather, it exists in an unconditioned manner, yet enclosed by particular conditions or states which are other than the essence itself. These particulars do not impact or conjoin in any way with the essence, while the essence remains unconditioned extramentally. So in each human being, human, right, will exist. Now, just how it exists, what's the nature of its existence, right, that we can talk about, you know. But this is how he doesn't want. He is pretty clear from this that it doesn't exist as a universal extramentally. It exists in particulars, but not you know, there's not a universal though. So when the essence, in the case animal, is considered together with the particular conditions and states, Avicenna refers to this as the natural thing, الشيء الطبيعي, as opposed to the animal in itself, which is the nature animal and exists prior to the existence of the natural thing. So so that's regarding the natural universal. Its ontological status is, it does exist extramentally, but not as a universal. And it exists in particulars. So the logical and mental universal remain to be explained, but you know, there's less controversy about the mental and logical universal. And so,
I'm sorry.
Yeah.
How does it exist in the particulars if it is a universal? In what way does he try to bring that to light, right? For all, as in contradistinction to those who would say there are no particulars, there are no universals, there are particulars.
extramentally, right?
Yeah, there are no extramental universals, there's only particulars, and that our mind sort of extracts from that something, like a mental, who would deny natural universality. So how would it exist in the particulars? In what way, what modality would it exist in if there's no universal floating around?
That's a good question. So this is, he will definitely say it's part of a particular.
Okay.
Now, even what does he mean by that? Like it's a juz min, he'll actually say that, right? And other people do hold that position too. Now, what does he mean here when he says it's a part of a particular? That there's a lot of discussion on, in the sense that, but he will maintain that, yes, when you do see a human being, it's not as, you'll see human, the essence, human being, not just instantiated, but it's actually there, existing in that particular human being. And it is what makes that thing a human, right? What constitutes it being human, all its qualities, all its particularities, and so, but doesn't exist as a universal, and so it's definitely not a physical part, right, of a human being, but yeah, that's something that what exactly he means by that, it's a bit unclear. Yeah.
This is a totally naive reading of.
No, please, yeah.
It sounds like he's saying it's impossible for, say, a human being to exist in such a way that it alone is common to a bunch of things. Which is to say, there's always going to be other accidents, other properties that things have in common. You can't just have a mere animal.
Correct. Yeah.
But that doesn't seem to imply that the universal isn't there. It's just it's not there alone. I don't know. This is.
I see what you're saying. Yeah.
I'm just.
Well, and what you mean here, the natural universal, then, right?
Yeah.
Okay. Because and here some scholars have said that what's implied here is that, okay, if you take a human being, when we say human, right, is that that's the essence of this particular human being, and it's there not as universal, but as it's there. What do we mean? What does he mean here when he says that it's there as part of this particular? Well, if a human being is a rational animal, a haywanun natiq, well, what is an animal, for example? Is that it's a body, al-jismu an-nami, right, al-mutaharrak. They have a definition of an animal that it's a body that grows and that moves volitionally, like based on its own volition. Well, aren't all those parts of a human being? And say, yeah, so it's there.
So
Yeah.
not as a universal.
Not as universal.
Just mean not alone and unaccompanied? Is that what it means? 'Cause that doesn't sound controversial.
I think both are intended here.
What is the other?
Like that's not the universal. So take any, like, let's say George, right? There is a universal, the natural universal of human, but not as a universal, meaning that's not the identical, or the human that exists in George is not as a universal. Yeah, he's.
I'm not sure.
Yeah.
Get that.
Sure. Yeah, we'll get to this. So that's the Abyssinian background, and we'll get to the Asharis right now, I think. Yeah. Okay.
So if taking these distinctions in the paper, cognitive realism, sparse realism, what would Ibn Sina, does he have a bloated realist ontology? Is there a universal for every term a universal refers to? Does he populate? Does universal sort of populate a category, or is it really just a few major ones that form the building blocks of all?
Oh, like are they the universals for fundamental things in reality?
Or is there a universal for every term, every category, like redness, blueness?
Yeah, he'll say those are all, as long as it can be predicated of many, then it's considered a universal, yeah. So it's not like there's only fundamental things which are universals, everything else is, yeah. But ontologically speaking, there are only particulars that exist, so yeah. Let's keep that question that you've raised. I think it's a good question, yeah. So let's get to the Asharis here really quick then. One of the great Ashari theologians of Giorgiani, he'll say the following, right? And this is on page... page 10. So he'll say, outside the mind, there is not an existent, right, which is the essence humanity, al-insaniya, for example, and another existence which is individuation, such that they combine to form a particular. So what he's saying here is that if you have you take this particular, it's not a natural object, but, let's assume it's a plant, right? I think we got some there. Even they're not natural plants, I guess, right? But let's assume that they're natural plants. So you have a particular... yeah. Be sharp, yeah. And so what we're looking at here, when they come, this is a particular plant. We're going to have this, there'll be this essence, plantness, right? Or being a plant. And then individuation, because it's a particular plant, right? And that's what it makes it, this idea of tashakhus, right? So Giorgiani's saying here is that you don't have these things kind of existing independent from each other. Rather, there's nothing other than one existence. So it's just that plant. By which I mean a particular ipseity, al-huwiya shakhsiyya. And we talked about that last night, Dean, about ipseity, right? So that's all that there is in this plant. It is, now, where do we make all these distinctions? He says, it is the intellect which divides it into a specific essence and individuation, just as it divides the specific essence into a genus and differentia. So when we say there's a genus, differentia, there's species, all of these type of things, these are all acts of the mind, and they're all carried about by the intellect, and that's why they're called secondary intelligibles. But is there a genus and species like in the actual physical object? No. These are all mental distinctions, intellectual distinctions that we're making here, right?
So that would be in contradiction, in distinction to what Avicenna was saying, that there is a kulli tabi'a.
We'll get to that.
Okay.
Yeah, hold on. Yeah. We're just kind of establishing the groundwork
Okay.
that all that exists, from an Ash'ari point of view, is theologians are particulars.
Right.
Right now, some people want to jump. They're nominalists. Well, let's see. Right on that, So, what happens? What's going on how do we form these essences and universals? So there's some passages here on the next page, and this is where Tash Kubrizadeh brings in another Ottoman theologian. He brings in this idea of abstraction here, and it's very interesting. So he said the soul. How do we form these essences that we've talked about, and how do we also form a universal afterwards? So he's saying here that the soul, by means of a distinct faculty which Allah, God, has placed in it and has configured the soul upon, abstracts essences subsisting in God's active knowledge. Now, it's not that we access God's knowledge, right? He's not going to say that. Rather, he's going to say, where do we abstract essences are from direct objects that we see. Now, these objects and the essences and what these objects are the way they are because they correspond to God's knowledge. Otherwise, they wouldn't. That's the only way they could exist, as they correspond in God's knowledge. So that's what he means here, is that when we do abstract the essence, when the human soul does abstract an essence, that essence is how God created it according to God's knowledge then. And that's how we have access to that.
And is the exercises, hold on,
Yeah.
I'm not cooperating well. So is the exercise of apprehending the essence of a thing meant to be an episode of inkishaf, of how it is in itself, and the determiner of how things are in themselves being their correspondence to God's knowledge?
Yeah, that's what he's getting at essentially here. So the way this...
So if it's correct,
Yeah.
in correspondence.
Yeah, because could there be things that go wrong? Could mistakes or errors be made? Yes. But if the process is done correctly,
Right.
then what that person knows of the essence of things will be the way that it corresponds to God's knowledge then.
So Hassan Jalabi, in his gloss on the Mu'aqif, will bring up those discrepancies where
Nice.
you could go wrong.
Yeah,
In theory, you could have the correct premises and the wrong conclusion.
correct.
You could have the right conclusion that somehow you ended up getting to, even though you were lining up your premises
Yeah,
wrong.
yeah, correct, yeah. And so he refers to this as receptive knowledge, meaning that it's al-ilm al-infiali, because the soul receives, right, these forms from external objects. That's very important epistemologically, and it may be a bit different than certain theories that we see in contemporary epistemology. And so the notion of abstraction here, intiza', refers to when the form of a particular occurs in the instrument of the soul. And here, he says, he means the khayal. It's an internal faculty of the soul. And then once that form is in the imaginative faculty, and then it readies and prepares the soul to have originated onto it a universal corresponding to that particular, which is present in the khayal. Consequently, and so that's received from God, though. It's very interesting, right?
And is khayal here imagination?
No, it should be imaginative faculty, right?
Imaginative faculty.
Yeah, not imagination. I should make that correction there. So it should be the imaginative faculty. And so when it's receiving this knowledge here, and it receives this universal that's coming from, that's basically coming from God here, and consequently from the divesting away of individual properties, hadf al-mushakhasat, of these particulars and essence forms in the soul, which corresponds to that object then. So, I mean, God's definitely a central part of this, of our act of knowing things and their essence is here, right? And yes, something can go wrong in this, divesting away of individual properties. Hadf al-mushakhasat, here's where mistakes can be made. And if it is done properly, if we are distinguishing between essential and accidental properties of a thing, which is very difficult, but if that's done correctly, then you'll have a correct, the essence that does form is corresponding to the thing as it is actuality, in actuality. Here, another, we have just some further insights here from on page 12 from another scholar, Qutbuddin al-Razi, who says that when we observe Zayd, for example, or George, and strip him of his individual conditions, there occurs in our minds from him. So once we separate the accidental properties from this human being, Zayd, once that's done, and if it's done correctly, what occurs in our minds from him is the form humanity, abstracted from all of its particulars and addenda. If we observed afterwards Khalid, another person, Fred, right, and strip him as well of his individual conditions, another form different from the form Zayd would not occur in the intellect, right? In fact, it's going to be the same form because we're looking at two humans. So it's the identical form when we look at two different humans that form. Rather, the form derived from Khalid is the same as the first form, contrary to when we observe, for example, a horse. So when we look at two different humans, 3, 4 different humans, it's going to be the same form that occurs to the soul, as opposed to when we look at a horse, it'll be a different form. Right?
Why is that? Because it's specific to the humans in the previous passage?
It has nothing to do with like humans in particular, but any natural object. And this is based on that natural objects have essences, which Dr. Jawad's talk tomorrow will take you through, establishing that. This is assuming that, So, and based off that, we can know an object. We can distinguish one object from another object, right? And when we look at something, we see something far away. It kind of looks blurry. It looks like a silhouette almost. But the moment it comes closer and closer and closer to you is when you start to know what that object is, and until you're able to observe it. Now, when you go through this process of abstraction, then you're able to understand what that object is, the essence, meaning here. And if you see an object that's supposed to be possess the same essence, you would arrive at the same essence here. So when we see different human beings, or if we see different plants, or if we see different animals, you name it, So now, what happens here, according to Ash'ari theologians, when we say animal is a universal? Well, there's a couple of things that's happening here. There's 4 things, and this is on page 17. I just want to bring us up to date there. So when we say animals are universal, there's 4 things that are happening here. One is the concept animal itself. So when we say al-haywan kulli, when we say animal is a universal, it's on page 17 here at the bottom. What we're saying here is there's 4 things. One is the concept haywan, min haythu huwa, right? The concept animal in itself. So we're looking at this proposition now. Animal is a universal, right? So we're looking at the concept animal in itself, the concept of the universal, and then we're looking at animal qualified with universality, and then we're looking at the aggregate composite of the two. Okay, so there's 4 different things happening here when we say animal is a universal, and you can apply that to anything we're claiming to be a universal here. Now, why is this important? Well, if we go back a couple of pages here, specifically to page 15. Sorry to do the jump around a bit, but and we'll end here with this, is that here there's a debate as to this first, so step one here, like, or the first thing that's going on, the concept animal itself, that's the natural universal, right? Now, does it exist extramentally or not? We heard Avicenna's position. Ash'ari theologians say here, this is Teptazani's position on page 15. He says here is that the second argument, he says here, Teptazani sums up his position as follows. The truth is that the natural universal exists externally in the sense that there is a thing externally to which the essence, right, the natural universal extends to, right? That's what he means when he says it does exist externally. When we when we consider the occurrence of universality to it, will be a natural universal. And the example he gives is of Zayd and Amr. So when Teptazani says the natural universal exists extramentally, he's saying that the natural universal, in this case animal or human, extends to Zayd, extends to Amr, right? Extending meaning the logical sense of coextension, right, and things like that. This understanding is clear, and this is what the Sheikh Avicenna referred to in the statement. This is how Teptazani is interpreting Avicenna's statement. The natural object to which commonness occurs to in the intellect exists externally. As for the essence, so that's the natural universal. As for the essence qualified with universality now, animal, as a universal, right? Teptazani says, and it occurring to it, existing externally, then there's no evidence for this. So he doesn't consider animal existing as a universal externally. On the contrary, self-evident rational principles dictate that universality negates external existence. It's a pretty packed statement there. Anybody knows Teptazani in Arabic too will understand why there's multiple commentaries on him. But this is from the Shamsiyah. And so here we see Teptazani presenting two ways of understanding what does it mean when we say the natural universal exists externally. One way of understanding it is that there is an external existent, mawjud, to which the natural universal extends. Not that the actual indeterminate essence exists externally. This is a reading Teptazani ends up supporting. Another reading is that it is the indeterminate essence qualified with universality which exists externally. This reading of Teptazani rejects due to it violating the rational principle which necessitates that universality negates externality. Consequently, for something to exist externally, qualified with universality is going to be rationally impossible. All right, there's a lot, and I think I'll end here. And then let's take, let's,